Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the virtual book launch of Slabbert, Man on a Mission by Grundlingh. My name is Jennifer Malik. I'm the editor of The Reading List, and we're hosting this launch tonight along with Jonathan Ball Publishers, the publishers of the book. In conversation with Albert this evening is Tony Leon. Tony is the founding leader of the Democratic Alliance and afterwards served as South African ambassador to Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. He is a qualified attorney and constitutional law lecturer and presently chairman of Resolve Communications. Tony is also the author of a number of books, and his latest, Future Tense Reflections on My Troubled Land, will be published by Jonathan Ball Publishers as well in March, I believe. So we're all looking forward to that as well. But the book that we're looking at tonight is Slabbert, Man on a Mission. Professor Grundlingh holds a doctorate from the University of South Africa and was the head of the history department at Stellenbosch University. He is the author, co-author, and editor of a number of books and has published numerous articles in international academic journals. He specializes in social and cultural history with a particular interest in war and society, and is also the co-author of a book on the history of rugby in South African society. The book we're launching tonight, Slabbert, Man on a Mission, is a penetrating biographical study that offers sharp insights into the thinking and motivation of a most unlikely politician, Frederick van Zyl Slabbert. Concise but wide-ranging, Slabbert, Man on a Mission provides new perspectives on a figure who even today remains something of an enigma. Slabbert is out now from Jonathan Ball Publishers, and it's available for purchase wherever books are sold, online or in stores. So if you haven't got yourself a copy yet, you can do that online while you're watching tonight or straight first thing tomorrow. Please leave your questions to the author in the comments section wherever you're watching this video, on YouTube or on Facebook. We'll be able to bring those questions up into the screen at the end of the launch. So after about 45 minutes or so, we'll be turning to your questions. So whatever questions you have to Albert or to, about the book or about the man that's the subject of the book, let us know, and we'll be answering some of those at the end of the session. Without further ado, let me hand over to Tony and Albert and enjoy the conversation.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. Thank you. And Albert, congratulations on this very fine book, which I enjoyed reading. And very recently in Politics Web, one of your fellow historians and also alumnus of Stellenbosch, Herman Gillemy, reviewed it and said it is an enthralling book that deserves a wide readership. It is an invaluable addition to our stock of biographies, to which one can only say amen. So, Albert, you've done, I think, in the concise form of this book, something very useful. It's analytical, part academic, it's personal, it's political, and it's anecdotal. So you cover a wide range. The first thing that struck me on reading the book, and after all, Van Zyl Slabbert, who had a very consequential personal and political life, has been dead for over a decade now, is that you didn't know Slabbert in any meaningful or personal way. And do you think that's an advantage or a disadvantage for a biographer in a work such as this?
Thank you, Tony. I've often pondered that question. And I've got to come to the conclusion that for an historian, it's actually better not to know a person that intimately or be befriended with that person. I think it does put some distance between oneself and the object, subject one is writing about. And it did allow me to pursue certain areas which might have been more difficult had I known him at all. So, to me, as an historian, I actually thought I'd benefited from that. But I've also, people of my generation, I've grown up with Slabbert at the back of one's mind in the 1980s in particular. And I've also manned PFP tables in less salubrious settings in Pretoria. So one had a certain subconscious awareness of the man. And I think all of that helped in trying to get to grips with such a mosaic figure. And what also helped was that I moved to Stellenbosch in 2001. And I did a history of Stellenbosch University, which alerted me to the kind of world of the 60s in which Slabbert found himself when he moved to Stellenbosch to study theology, and the kind of issues that were raised. Stellenbosch, as a matter of fact, as I point out in the book, there were some people who were quite politically, progressively more advanced than often made out to be. So all of these things combined. But I must say there's sorry, you were saying.
No. Just staying with Stellenbosch, obviously the last major post in Slabbert's life, shortly before he died, was being made Chancellor of the University, of which he is a very distinguished alumnus. You do make the point, and you've alluded to it now, that Stellenbosch University, not just as a place, but as an intellectual incubator, played a very, very significant role in Slabbert's life and in his development and in his thoughts. And you, of course, make the interesting point that another rather famous, some would say infamous, professor of sociology emanating from Stellenbosch was Hendrik Verwoerd. Just stay with that Stellenbosch theme for one moment, briefly, and its role in Slabbert's development and his impact on the university in turn.
Yes, Stellenbosch challenged Slabbert, but one has also got to bear in mind he didn't come from the kind of usual solid middle-class Afrikaner background. He came from quite a fractured background. And he was in school hostels from the age of 10. He had to fend for himself from a relatively young age, unlike many of his peers at the campus. So Slabbert arrived here as an old soul. He's seen much at that point already. But he was clearly intellectually minded. He wanted to have a rational understanding of the world in which he found himself, and having to be critical of apartheid at that time. You had to know what you were talking about, because it was such a dominating ideology. To unpack that, to disassemble that, called for considerable mental gymnastics at the time, given the kind of environment in which he found himself.
Just a personal anecdote and reflection. In about 2000, or the year 2000, Concise Slabbert made a very interesting speech where he said, there was every reason that at least there should be one Afrikaans-speaking university in the south of the country, Stellenbosch, and one in the arguably Potchefstroom. I thought this was rather a good idea, and I put it into a speech, and I sent a copy of the speech to the then rector of Stellenbosch, Chris Brink, and he reacted with fury to the idea and told me to keep my nose out of the university's business, because, of course, Stellenbosch was then going in a very controversial direction for its language policy. And, the inference, obviously, is that someone as liberal and advanced thinking as Slabbert didn't approve of that course.
Slabbert had a very close relationship with Afrikaans. He never distanced himself from his Afrikaans roots, and interesting enough, already in 1964, he spoke to Richard van der Ros and Adam Small about Afrikaans and the future of Afrikaans. Already at that point, he was fully aware that the stigma that was attached to Afrikaans. As far as the later incidences are concerned, I think Slabbert had a proper understanding of where Afrikaans should be intellectually, but I didn't pick up that he knew the mechanics of the university and the changing demography of the university. Now, I don't want to get into the whole language debate, which
no. That occupies for many hours, and it's an ongoing debate, and there's been much litigated around. I had a very, deep dive when I read your book on the issue that you raise in the introduction, where you said there's a conflict between the politics on the one hand and the individual on the other. And you say the choices made are very vexed ones in this regard. And I wondered, because obviously, as you describe, and as is known, Concise Slabbert, who had many missions in his life and almost a multiplicity of different lives in different directions, was, as you say, enigmatic. And in 2010, when a Fetscript was put together by his friends, the title I thought was very interesting was The Passion for Reason. So if I could ask you, just on your deep dive into Slabbert's life, thoughts, works, and personality, which do you think, how did those balance out with him? The reason, which was the logical, cool, analytical, and the passion, which drove a lot of his decision making.
Yeah. That was the intriguing part of dealing with this. And I think the key to understanding Slabbert is a combination of rationality and idealism. And these weren't always parceled out in equal measures. But I do think if one had to summarize it, it's that constituted the overarching dynamics of his outlook. And that's what turned me to the notion of man on a mission. And he never abandoned the idea of converting people. But they had to be converted, and that's where the irony comes in. They had to be converted on a rational basis. Now, conversion doesn't always work that way. It's got an emotional element to it. But Slabbert thought he could achieve that. And if it's rational enough, then people will buy into it. But he himself, at times, behaved in a manner not outrageously so, but he was impulsive at times.
Yes.
And I think that added to the complications and the kind of problems he experienced in selling his message.
Well, makes for a much richer biography because, I was reflecting on when you were describing many of the gifts, and Slabbert was multi-gifted, as you say, charismatic, good-looking, good rugby player, good background, spoke the right language for the politics of the time. David Cameron once said that politics is show business for ugly people. Well, obviously, Slabbert was almost the opposite of that. And towards the end of your book, on about page 250, you weigh up all these gifts, and then you deal with what you call the somewhat intractable issue of what you call his 5-year attention span. That for all these gifts, he somewhat hopscotched around. And did he land where you think he wanted to land, or was it just that he suffered from divine discontent because he had this, all these gifts and this imagination and this restlessness, or do you think there was some kind of logic or reason behind the arc of his life?
Yeah, that's one of the issues that intrigue me, and that I spend a lot of time pondering upon that. As for, I don't know how successfully, but you're obviously quite right. The so-called attention span, that he moved from one position to another, not necessarily in rapid succession, but quite rapidly at times. And I try to understand the dynamics behind that. And I felt, without being overly psychologically inclined, that the wider contextual factors he faced as a child, he can go, once you go back to his past, to locate that early patterning. From a very young age, he and his sister were moved from pillar to post. Right. As family life was concerned, he knew more about discontinuities than he knew about continuities. And that's a pattern he came to live with. To others, it may seem strange. He didn't find it all that strange. He didn't necessarily invite it all the time, but to him, he was prepared to take the chance, and he was used to not being secure in all respects. So, in that sense, I think that those were the well springs that one can argue, and which I did argue, played a part in what you call the so-called hopscotching. But also, I think there's an element there when it's got to be. Sorry, I just want to add to that it's a question of overreach. It is not that he failed to do things; it is that he wanted to do too much. And I do emphasize that point as well.
Well, of course, he did an enormous amount in a very well-lived life in a relatively short space of time. One of the interesting features of your book, and people I know from having written a few of my own love this, is you deal with his interaction with some very significant political personalities and some of the backstories. And what was intriguing about your book and about the Slabbert story in a way was he had what you just used the adjective a frosty relationship with Nelson Mandela and a rather cool and distant relationship with F.W. de Klerk, who of course were the two people who brought about the birthing of the democratic South African current form. But he had a much more intense relationship, as it were, with two other outsized presidents, the one he encountered as leader of the opposition, P.W. Botha, and then later on with Thabo Mbeki, and we'll get on to Mbeki in a moment. But just as a backstory, just as context, obviously it's all in the book and everyone must read the book, is the issue of P.W. Botha, because you describe in detail the very significant meeting, one-on-one meeting Slabbert had with Botha on the 25th of November 1985, when Botha was president. And the backstory that, just to give some context to that, is that Slabbert had been on a trip to Australia with Colin Eglin and had started discussing whether a combination of jet lag or vino, you're not too sure, his plan, which flabbergasted Eglin, that all PFP MPs should resign their seats and stand in by-elections and to try and crash the tricameral system. And one of Eglin's responses immediately was to say, Slabbert, give it a go, but go and speak to Botha directly and see what his thinking is as to whether the system can be reformed in the way that you think it needs to be. So can you just briefly describe what happened at that meeting? There were two versions of it, obviously, Botha's and Slabbert's, and how important that meeting was in driving Slabbert's decision he made early the following year to leave Parliament and the PFP leadership.
Slabbert arrived back via Canada, and he was obviously jet lagged, but he had the appointment with the PW. Initially, it went quite well. Slabbert adopted almost kind of attitude in Afrikaans, met my oom praat, as if I'm talking to my uncle. A kind of a vanquished kind of relationship, because he knew he didn't want to antagonize P.W. Botha with his notorious
quick temper,
unnecessarily. And he tried to sell the idea that it's possible to talk to the ANC, that the teeth can be drawn, the ANC's teeth can be drawn. And initially it went quite well. But then as it carried on, P.W. Botha said whether Slabbert knew that he, P.W. Botha, had the support of the majority of black people in the country. And therefore it wasn't really necessary to change because he's got that support. Slabbert was flabbergasted. Remember, this is during the state of emergency. And he just couldn't believe this. At that point, he realized this man has got no grip on what's happening in the country. And he left completely disappointed. And his sister, when he saw his sister Marcia at the time, and he was almost a broken man. That he felt that there's no way he could proceed. But then at that point, obviously P.W. Botha being an old jackal, he typed the interview, and from that
he didn't know it was being taped at the time.
He didn't know. He wasn't aware of that. Now I don't know whether that is usual practice in politics. I can assume P.W. Botha did it regularly anyway. He released the tape and selectively, and it appeared that this interview went quite well. Yeah. So that put Slabbert at a disadvantage. But I think the interview was only the tip of the iceberg. There were a lot of other things where I can just briefly summarize it. He had the tricameral parliament, the 1983 referendum, which he lost. The fact that the breaching of the Nkumati Accord, which the Nats kept him in the dark about, and he also felt morally compromised. He stays in Parliament. He's seen as to be a good guy in Parliament, but he doesn't achieve anything. And he was getting sick and tired of being the punchbag on the one hand and being the good guy on the other hand. If you are serious about getting rid of apartheid, perhaps the Parliament is not the right place to be at.
You deal with that. Because, I mean, the resignation of Slabbert from Parliament and from the leadership of the PFP was an act of enormous consequence for him personally, for the country, for the politics. Of course, we don't know because it's unknowable, and you deal with all sides of the issue very well in your chapter called Resignation from page 128 onwards. Whether it actually achieved what Slabbert set out to do with it, because in a way, Slabbert somewhat changed the goals as he was going along. On the one hand, his initial plan was PFP MP should resign. In the end, only Alex Bahrain followed him. And he said to his caucus, "This is my political statement because I regard Parliament as a waste of time in terms of the achievement of the idea of a non-racial democracy and building a parliamentary party that could effectively bring it about." So he saw that very much as a political statement, which might help, if you like, break the logjam, quite aside from his personal frustrations and his deep dissatisfaction with how the protagonists such as P.W. Botha and Chris Yunus were responding to a reform agenda. On the other hand, of course, you had a pushback from within his party. Helen Suzman, most famously regarded as an act of self-indulgence. And then you had the very acerbic, curmudgeonly, if I might say, editor of the Sunday Times or Business Day, Ken Owen, who wrote this polemic called J'accuse, where he said that Slabbert had betrayed first his voters, his funders, second his party, and third the parliamentary process as an alternative to violent change. So, I mean, you had these very divergent, and of course then Thabo Mbeki, we'll get on to him, was the first person out of the blocks to herald the bravery of the decision. You had a really cross-section of responses.
Yeah, it's also the impact on the PFP, as you realize. I think you were just about to enter politics when this transpired. And
I need to just add, before you respond, that I was the candidate in a by-election in Johannesburg, so I don't want to make this too personal, but it had a rather monumental effect on my campaign. We had a safe PFP seat in Yeoville in Johannesburg, and I just saw my majority disappearing, which went down from 350 in the last election to 39, because people just on the ground among the electorate thought, well, some voters said to me, what's the point of voting for your party if your leaders lost faith in it? And that was obviously the white view, if you like.
Yeah, Slabbert's attitude or response to that would have been, and I got it in the book, is that if the party can't stand on its own, if they need him to boost the party all the time, then his leadership has been a failure. They need to stand on their own feet and they need to carry on regardless. There was a structural problem as well at the time that the UDF was moving onto the left of politics. And the NATS presented itself as a centrist party. The UDF now at the forward scouting role, which the PFP used to occupy. And the Conservative Party was on the right. So the PFP and a certain at that junction was gasping for air. So I think there were other factors as well, but they regrouped quickly enough. And there's a bit about him in the book. It's a guy called Ross. It's called Ross the Boss.
Neil, the chief organizer.
Yeah. He seems to have been quite a remarkable organizer. And he managed to draw the party together. But anyway, it didn't quite succeed. But I think the fact that Slabbert left wasn't the only reason why the PFP battled during the 87 election.
Yeah, of course, it's always the question, is it what the Marxists call the motive force of events, or is it human agency? And it's although just in my experience, the leader of a party is hugely determinative in the fate of parties. And, great leaders can build great parties, bad leaders, do the reverse. And he obviously was a very gifted leader for the time of his leadership. And quite evidently, when he left, and let's accept his reasoning was very logical and did move the dynamic, it did have a huge effect on the fortunes of his party as a material factor. But, the other personality who is a running theme in this book, of course, is Thabo Mbeki, because one of the first things that Slabbert did after leaving Parliament was with Alex Bahrain. He set up IDASA, and the first initiative of IDASA in the headlines was the safari to Dakar of Afrikaans-speaking intellectuals and some others. And, it really did show that there was the possibility of dialogue. We can get and some interaction beyond just sort of shouting each other across the historic divide. We can get onto the consequence of Dakar in a minute, but let's just stay with Thabo Mbeki, because as a result of that meeting, a relationship was established between the two of them. And you deal with this at some length in your book, particularly towards the end, page 203 and 4 and onwards. And, Slabbert initially arranged accommodation for Mbeki when he came back to Johannesburg after exile. They had quite a lot of interaction. He thought they had a friendship, and then later recanted that it was not the friendship he had in mind. But do you think, and this is a broad question which you do answer, but just perhaps headline it, that Thabo Mbeki played Van Zyl Slabbert, and that Slabbert's generosity of spirit and warmth was a foil to someone as calculating as Mbeki? Was that an oversimplification of how the relationship unwound as it did in 1999 and afterward?
There are some commentators that said Mbeki led Slabbert up the garden path, or rather that Slabbert allowed himself to be led up the garden path. My opinion of that relationship is that one has got to look at it historically and change over time. At the point in 87, they both needed each other, and there was a warmth and a generosity in that relationship. When after 1990 that waned, Slabbert was said that Mbeki now needs Slabbert far less than he used to need him during the 1980s. And so there were political reasons for that, but also, in a way, they were different kind of people. Slabbert was gregarious, outgoing, and Mbeki less so. He was much more clinical and calculating than Slabbert. Slabbert, he thought that he could ride that difference, but that didn't happen. They were supposed to have a meeting shortly before Slabbert died, but then obviously the meeting didn't take place. So it riled Slabbert greatly, this breakup with Mbeki, because during the Dakar meeting, he said something along the lines that I'm prepared to die for this bugger. Yeah. There was that kind of warmth, which then evaporated in the 90s.
Yes. Just talking about Dakar, you deal with it correctly at some length, and both the logistics, which were extraordinary, and the architecture of the meeting, and some of the less savory aspects, such as Mac Maharaj feigning injuries he didn't have, which are fantastic stories. But later on, you deal with, as Slabbert described, you call it the vanquished appeal of Dakar, and how by 2003, Slabbert had kind of changed his view on the usefulness and even the outcomes of such dialogues. If I could just quote briefly from something he wrote then, which you reprise in the book. This is Slabbert. The more I listened, the more depressed I became. The rhetoric of revolt was simply the flip side of the rhetoric of repression. Each defined success as the total elimination of the other. Only then could the ideological be achieved. I could see endless attrition at enormous cost to the country and its people. Well, you could say that apart from its eloquence, he was very prescient. Do you think he he clearly did by 2003 have a different view of what he'd helped to engineer, say, in 1987?
He was becoming quite cynical at that point. And I think what might have played a part in it, although one has got to check the dates, is his experience with the Electoral Commission.
We'll try and get to that as well.
Okay, yeah. Which he felt that he was completely being abused by the ANC.
He used that term. And it's quite interesting because you can argue about, as you do in the book, that, leaving Parliament in 1986, and then change came to Parliament via Parliament with de Klerk 4 years later, and maybe that didn't achieve all it set out to do. But in many ways, one of the lasting legacies of Van Zyl Slabbert in terms of the country going forward could be the issue of electoral reform, because it's now become a very major drumbeat that the system itself is broken. And although he, was completely poleaxed by Kader Asmal and others, because the commission was set up structurally with a problem that Buthelezi, who was close to Slabbert, was the Minister of Home Affairs at the time, therefore he had very little following in cabinet, and Slabbert's report was utterly shelved. But maybe it was one of those ideas which is actually still to see the light of day in a meaningful sense here.
Yeah, I think it's one of the aspects that it was one of Slabbert's enduring aspects that are often not recognized. Constitutional matters are not sexy enough to get that kind of headlines. And but here we are, 2020. Slabbert's ideas are being, or 21. Slabbert's ideas are being resurrected. Last year they were resurrected again.
Yes.
So I think one has got to bear that in mind, and to make the point that how far ahead he was, even that came from the 1970s, about targeting the Constitution, that we need a new Constitution.
Yeah.
And the way that played out was one of those enduring insights and enduring legacy. Just to get back to Dakar, sorry, can I just say
Please,
something?
I'm simply, you must speak, Professor. I'm just a facilitator.
Yeah, I know, because I remember Dakar quite well from personal experience. I wasn't asked, obviously. I was kind of too boring and academic, really, to get involved in these things. But I had some friends there. What struck me was the way Dakar developed in the public imagination. That this was seen as the central event that led to 1990. I got reservations about that, because what I was unaware of at the time, until fairly recently unaware of, was a two-track policy being followed, that the National Party also spoke to the ANC, and they had the power. So the Slabbert Dakar venture might have loosened the props of society, but at the same time, there was also a National Party government initiative to talk to the ANC, which ultimately should also be recognized. And we can't just focus on Slabbert's Dakar only. It should be balanced by the efforts of the state at the time.
No, well, look, there were these two powerful forces. There was the National Party government, who was the ANC in exile. And I think that's the liberal dilemma, Albert. Slabbert personified it, but it's not unique to him. And all his successors grappled with it. When you have two powerful forces who are at daggers drawn and at war with each other, and one of them, in the position of power, decides to start a process of negotiation, even in secret, as it was between Kobie Coetzee and Nelson Mandela to start with, and then through others.
Also, Neil Barnard also.
Absolutely. Yeah. You don't need some liberal intermediary, however gifted or charismatic or useful that person is. And so in a sense, to use that African expression, the grass gets trampled on when the elephants start dancing. And I guess that is always the dilemma of some third entity, such as the liberal enclave that Slabbert occupied and led for a time.
Yes, it was very important at the time, but I think its long-term consequences were less important. Not that they were immaterial, but they were less important. And I noticed this by looking at the way in which the Dakar event was commemorated, as it were, remembered by participants. And I was fortunate enough to be invited to the one in 2017. And there it was clear that whatever magic was in 1987, 2017, all of that has disappeared. So over time it's lost its importance, and in a way it's a symbolic significance.
But
Although
wasn't apart from the personal, personalities involved and the forces, there's the famous historical construct of Nixon in China, or Menachem Begin making peace with Egypt. That you have to be of the conservative governing establishment to achieve change with the enemies of that establishment. And I guess I was once watching a movie of Nelson Mandela and the Jews, and they had Ronnie Kasrils and Joe Slovo, and someone sitting next to me said, these individuals, great as they might have been, have as much in common with the Jewish community as the man in the moon. I mean, they were outriders. They were not indicative of the community. And I guess one of the things is that Slabbert and the Dakar grouping were very impressive people, but they didn't represent their community in any major.
I think they probably did represent Afrikaners to a greater extent than Slovo and
the Jews, yes.
Represented Jewry, yeah. But Slabbert never got, and I think that made the Dakar important was that it was Afrikaners or so-called Afrikaners who went there. That it was an Afrikaans venture.
Yes.
Which was different if you had taken a number of English-speaking liberals that wouldn't have had the same kind of effect.
A few of them snuck into that Dakar initiative, but not
Yeah,
many.
that's right. It was a great adventure in a way for some of them.
Yeah.
Just as an aside, because it's something which I came across and which historians like picking up these little snippets of information about Ters Ehlers. He was PW's private secretary, getting on to a friend, Jan Hubert from Stellenbosch, that despite all the antagonism between PW, Botha and Slabbert, he did think of Slabbert as a possible successor. If Slabbert could change his view somewhat and watch his step and be a bit more pliable, he saw in him a kind of possible successor. That's a turn-up for the books. And I don't know whether, with your experience in our politics, whether this kind of thinking, this kind of flighting of offbeat ideas, whether these happen at all.
Well, they do. And talking about offbeat ideas and Slabbert, you relate in the book in November 1998, I was asked by Bill Johnson and Laurie Schlemmer to attend a dinner at Slabbert's house in Parkview in Joburg. And I was then the leader of the DP, and we were going into the 1999 general election in quite good form. It looked like we would overtake the Nats as the official opposition, as we did. And it was a very pleasant evening, very convivial, very good wine, and he made a very nice tomato breedy. But it became clear, I wasn't a bit vague about the agenda, that Slabbert was actually thinking about a return to politics in that election. And in a roundabout way, we got down to the issue, and he was thinking, well, maybe he could make himself available as the candidate for Premier of the Western Cape. And then I said, well, that's a very intriguing idea. Hadn't discussed it. First I'd heard of it. So we had a few party processes and a couple of people whose nose had been out joint, but Slabbert, as you indicate, is a very big figure. And I said to him, Van, the issue is this, that we are going to there's going to be no outer majority in the Western Cape. It's going to be a hung parliament. And our voters, we are not going to go into a coalition with the ANC. We are going to form an opposition coalition, and that will mean the Nats. And, then he got very emotional about the National Party, understandably, given the background. And it was inconclusive. The next day, he sent me a fax, as we did this so long ago, and said, look, great evening, thanks very much for the time, but I'm not going to do it. And indeed, he went further just before the election in a report he wrote, basically crossed his own Rubicon and was going to cast a vote for the ANC in the 1999 election. So, that was interesting because, I don't think the DEP or the DA would have survived if we'd done a deal with the ANC as an opposition party. But I've often thought about the prospects of Slabbert returning and how he would have enjoyed being a provincial premier, which was, I think, in his mind, a possibility in late 1998.
Yeah, the thing is, he considered options like that, but I'm not quite sure how convinced he was. It reminds me a bit of when he first went into Parliament, when they tried to convince him to join the United Party, and he took the slip which he was supposed to nominate him, but he crumbled the piece of paper and left. And so Horace van Rensburg was furiously searching for his application to become a member of the United Party, and then Colin Eglin caught him at the airport and said, "No, you got to join the PFP." So
Yes.
I don't think one can put too much store by that.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, you do make the point. So Opa was by a goeie sap.
Ja. In Pietersburg nogal.
Nogal.
Yeah.
But so just because we're going to open up for questions in 5 minutes, one of the most vexed questions that we face as a country is the issue of race and non-racialism. You write in your book, Slabbert could not have foreseen the way in which race would be would be flouted more than 2 decades after the advent of black majority rule to advance affirmative action policies according to race. But without interfering with your prodigious research, Van in 2006 addressed a conference of the Solidarity Trade Union in Pretoria. I guess you probably had reference to it. We actually took on these policies as we knew them in 2006. Of course, they've been massively intensified since Slabbert died, and to the point that we meet now. And he said, and I thought I've often used this quote myself because it's a big issue in the DA and other formations today. He said, if you make yourself hostage to a racist past, you can plan for a racist future. Very profound words, and very, once again, also far-sighted, given now the
I think that is powerful, and Slabbert's views on that changed over time. By that point already, he was convinced that this thing is getting out of hand.
Yeah.
And I think that non-racial idea has withered away by that point.
Albert, if I could, just before we take questions, just press on that point a little. I mean, you do detail correctly how Slabbert changed or even abandoned some of his early views about consociationism and minority vetoes and the constitutional arrangements, but he very much stuck fast to the view of non-racialism in the proper sense. That he never changed.
Yeah, but I don't think that idea originated, but I think it became prominent as a result of the UDF. When the UDF appeared on the scene, he felt this is something which is non-negotiable. And if we need to get the ANC, well, the UDF on first and then the ANC on our side, this is a core issue. And that is something which we can build upon. But then it's got to be taken seriously, and it's got to be debated, and it's got to be dealt with in a nuanced manner. I think that was his view of non-racialism, not blanket steamrolling. Yes.
As he made clear. Okay, well, Albert, thank you very much for a very
thanks, Tony.
You certainly, I think the book, as we say in Afrikaans, dis van selfsprekend. Dis 'n baie goeie book.
Yeah.
I hope that the readers will enjoy it. I'm going to hand back to Jennifer now because she's got questions from the viewing audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony.
Cool. Thanks so much for a really fascinating conversation so far. We have a couple of questions from people watching online. I'm going to bring them up on the screen and I'll read them out for those people who may be sight impaired. Anas asks, what is the greatest lesson Dr. van Zyl Slabbert taught you while writing his life story?
Yeah, I think I've reached a point in my life where I'm careful about learning new lessons, and I'm reluctant to learn new lessons. But as a professional historian, I regard myself as very fortunate in having tackled this subject. And it showed me that our history, although I've never written biographies, is such a multi-dimensional subject. In terms of that, that's probably the greatest lesson I can take away in terms of my professional career.
Yeah, that's a interesting answer. We have a question from Francois who says, can Albert perhaps expand on Slabbert and Adam Small's relationship?
I haven't got much detail on that, Francois, but I can try and dig up something on that. This was the event that I referred to. They met at, I think it was Hou Pas Inn, where they discussed the issue of Afrikaans. The fact that Small spoke to him, or Small spoke to lots of people, so did Van der Ross, but that was unusual in '64, so it must have been a good relationship. But I haven't got any kind of specific details on that.
Okie dokie. Then we have a question from, a comment, as always, in a book launch. Douglas says, I hope you're not going to wait until 10 years after Tony goes to heaven to write a biography of him. Okay, and then another question from Louis. How did you manage to combine your academic background with that of writing such an easy read? Usually the two are exclusionary, and I can contest that as well.
I made a conscious effort to be less boring and to write a kind of different narrative, because I had a different audience in mind. It had to be based on proper research. I had to take in academic angles, but it wasn't meant to be for academics only. I've written for eggheads long enough, so I thought perhaps I must try my hand at something else now.
So did you have to edit yourself, or did you find, how did you find the process?
I had a very good editor, Alfred Demetre, from Jonathan Ball, who assisted me greatly. But obviously, one is responsible for one's own prose. So, yeah.
Did you find it easy to slip into a more sort of layperson's style of writing, or?
No. I think at times it can be more difficult because there are all kinds of academic shortcuts and that kind of academic speak, where one doesn't have to explain that much. But if you write for more of a lay audience, you've got to be much clearer about what you want to say.
Right. And then there's a question from Ian. It's quite a long one, so it's taking up our faces, but I'll take it down once I've read it. The intellectual roots of Slabberts thinking. What did you pick up about that during the research process? Which philosophers or political thinkers or social theorists inspired Slabbert?
Well, I've just been talking about it. I didn't write for academics. He comes with an academic question. First of all, I had to dig into Talcott Parsons' systems theory, which he was partial to that, but he didn't quite buy it. But the important thing of that was, how does one test a theory, whether it's valid or not, and its application. And then, of course, Popper's work, that was central to his thinking. Slabbert didn't publish all that much academically. As a matter of fact, he was very young when he became head of the sociology department at Wits. He was only 33, and at that point he didn't really have an article out already. There was one which appeared shortly afterwards. But now one has got to bear in mind as well that sociology is a relatively new subject. I think the first PhD in English was only awarded in '65. So the Brits didn't take to sociology the way Americans did. And the same kind of attitude is prevalent in South Africa. So, but I would then look at Talcott Parsons and Popper as the key influences in Slabbert's academic life.
Okay, cool. People are asking questions as I'm reading them out, so clearly you have inspired some debate or people getting people's.
There's about the archives of writing. The Slabbert archives at Stellenbosch University is quite rich. But you've got to dig for the material. It's not all in one place. It's very well organized, but you won't find a select archives dealing only with his speeches. But there's plenty of that. He was also a prolific writer in the newspapers and in other journals.
So you did quite,
books himself.
You did quite a lot of,
yeah, he wrote a lot of books himself on politics.
That's right, yeah.
So you did quite a lot of primary research in the archives for the book.
Yes, that's the one thing that makes historians stand out. They do take archives seriously. Yeah.
Ian asks, another Ian, different Ian, would you comment on the challenges you faced writing this particular biography?
First of all was to get the format, to get the format right, and secondly, at times, like most writers, one experience a kind of sense that the sky is so complex. Will I get it right? And this is just not the kind of thing which you can easily resolve. You just got to go on writing and hope it pans out, and then rewrite where you think you're not actually representing what you want to say. Like most writing, it's difficult, but I found eventually, I think, I did manage to try and capturing in a nuanced way, but one could also be too nuanced, that you're that nuanced that you don't actually say something. On the one hand this, on the other hand that, and what are you saying? So those are the kind of traps one should try and avoid.
So you say you get a first draft down and then mold it from there?
Oh, yeah, a couple of drafts, not only one.
Geez, people are like sending in the questions now, but that's fine because we've still got a bit of time. Francois asks, is Slabbert's idea of non-racialism compatible with other non-racialisms? For example, the ANC's Freedom Charter, PAC's Africanism, the Unity Movement, Black Consciousness, etc.
I think there are a difference in emphasis, that Black consciousness, non-racialism, actually, if one, that's a whole debate on its own, but it does imply that there's a kind of thinking in Black consciousness that blacks can't be racist, to be blunt about it. And therefore, non-racialism comes easily. Slabbert wouldn't have approved of that kind of thinking. So there are different emphases. And the term non-racialism has been bandied about so much that I do think it's lost some of its import and it's lost some of its substance. And it's being abused by so many people nowadays that Slabbert would abhor the way it's being used nowadays.
Cool. Kristen asks, what is Slabbert's legacy with regards to leadership in South Africa? What inspired his leadership? It's going backwards and forwards.
I think probably the central point is to go beyond the immediate. Like Slabbert had to go beyond apartheid. He had to envisage a new South Africa. We've now reached that point where we probably should start envisaging a new South Africa as well, after all we've been through recently. His leadership was inspired by a sense of equality, a sense of a vision that South Africa can be successful if there's a buy-in in certain values. These values are enshrined by the Constitution, and that is key to it. But the Constitution is also politics, and that's got to be mediated. I think those ideas were probably key to his thinking.
And Chet asks, are there any parts of the biography which proved particularly challenging to portray?
Yes, I think that the politics had its problems, but what I found particularly daunting was dealing with his personal life. There's a separate chapter dealing with his personal life, explaining charisma, explaining his friendships, explaining his relationship with his family. Those were sensitive areas to traverse, and I had to be very careful about the way I went about that. So it wasn't, I deliberately tried to eschew any kind of sensationalism.
And Peter asks, did you find any other biographies helpful in crafting this work?
Yes, Peter. I did look at John F. biographies on John F. Kennedy, although the conditions differed to such an extent that it was a useful guide, but I couldn't take all that much out of them. I looked at Hancock's work on smudge, which I was familiar with anyway, and also Alan Paton's work on Hofmeyr. So yeah, I looked at a number of those, and then I came to realize that I better I need to find my own voice. When I reach that point too.
Cool. There's a final question from Cheryl. She says, how much is the book and where can we get it? Sounds fascinating. So
how many copies do you want? How many copies do you want, Cheryl?
Every home should have one, I say.
The recommended retail price is $275.
That's right, yeah.
And it is yeah, you go.
Okay,
you
Jennifer.
go. Oh, sorry.
It's
available online on all the major retailers and in all bookshops as well, as far as I understand.
Yeah.
So
it's widely available.
Yeah, widely available. Yeah, I've seen it out in Barton exclusives and the independents and everything. So yeah, available everywhere. I'm going to hand back over to Tony for some concluding remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jennifer, and for those very interesting questions. You know, as I said to Albert, Das van Selfsprekend. It's a very good book. It deals with really a range of lives contained in one very consequential life, because there's the personal, there's the political, there's the change of trajectory, there's the different careers, the different environments, and you know, I think it's very well done, complexity with a light touch. So, you know, I'm not just saying that because I'm the unpaid discussant on this book. I'm saying it because I really found, I knew the Slabbert story. I knew him not that well. We had a few encounters. And I'd read every book that Slabbert ever wrote, both his own biographical attempts. And I have to say, for all Van Zyl Slabbert's extraordinary achievements, he wasn't a great biographer of himself or autobiographer. But this book really, I think, you know, fills a lot of gaps and does it in a respectful way without being hagiographic. And so I think what I began our conversation with Herman Gillemi's applause for this book is significant and is very well merited. So again, congratulations, Albert. Jennifer, thanks so much for this discussion. And to
we actually had a question that said, what does Tony think about the book? So we've now answered that one. I think Monica echoes what we're all thinking. Thank you for a fabulous discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Okay. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Jennifer.
So much,
Thank you very much for joining us.
Albert.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.